their internal market collapsed, so industrial demand went away. And that meant you had wells shut in the permafrost. And when that happened, the wells become damaged, and you get frost and water expansion damage up and down the pipes and in the wellheads themselves, and eventually you have to rebuild most of the system. That took them 30 years last time. So Nord Stream is like the issue of the moment, like literally right now, this moment. But there is a half a dozen other things that are semi-related behind the scenes that are perfectly capable of making any German hope for getting back to some sort of old normal or transitioning to a new normal on a time frame they can't control. And in that sort of environment, I am very concerned about what happens with German manufacturing, and I'm even more concerned about what that means for Germany's position within the Western world. Because it feels to me like the Russians are presenting the Germans with a simple choice. We can keep the lights on for you, but that means you're out of the coalition that is supporting Ukraine, and that means the logistics that you have that is supporting Ukraine are no longer in play. Or you can do this without us. Well, Ian, you want to split that in half? I can take the economic side if you want to take the political and strategic.
Sure.
Okay, so economically, Russia is the world's largest source of fertilizer and the components that are necessary to make fertilizer, specifically 40% of potash. Russia is the world's second largest energy exporter in terms of oil, number one with natural gas, which is not just used for fuel, especially in Germany. It is used as an industrial input. It's the base of German heavy industry. It is arguably one of the top three items that the Germans have in terms of making their industry globally competitive. And so if something happens to that, you're talking about a loss of the world's third largest manufacturing base. The energy that the Russians export in oil form, that's about 5 to 8% based on who's doing the math in terms of global energy supply. And oil supply and demand mechanics are inelastic. So if you take off 5% of global energy, you can count on prices roughly doubling. There's no way we can have globally available fossil fuels without the Russians as part of the system. On the flip side, they are also major players in things like platinum and palladium and lithium and rhodium and nickel and copper. You also can't have the green transition without the Russians. So the Russians and Germans, time and time again, generation on generation, have had this weird dance where they have to be each other's largest economic partner, but they are also each other's largest strategic rival. So they move together to try to avoid a war. A conflict happens anyway. They hive apart. There's economic dislocation as a result, which the rest of the world knows as a recession or depression. And then they repeat it. They've been doing this for centuries. And this is probably the last time they do it, in my opinion, because of demographic restrictions. So who, quote, wins, unquote, this time around really matters. Well, it's just math, and math is diabolical, so I understand why most people don't follow it. It also takes a long time. Changes that are made to demographic factors today are not going to fully manifest for a generation or two. It's just that the root cause of all of this is the mass urbanization and the mass industrialization that happened in the aftermath of World War II and then really got intense in the post-Cold War system. So think of a demographic structure like a pyramid, with all of the babies down at the bottom, followed by the toddlers, followed by the children, followed by the teenagers. And as you go up that pyramid, it gets narrower and narrower because of simple mortality. Now, until we get to roughly 1800, the whole world was a pyramid. Lots of children, very few retirees, everyone else stacked up in the middle. With industrialization and urbanization, however, we got better health systems, and that meant infant mortality went down. But we also got urbanization, which means people had fewer kids. So that very bottom tier, the children, it got narrower in terms of fewer children, but then everybody lived like an extra 2 or 3 years. So the rest of the pyramid lifted straight up. You repeat that a half a dozen times as the technologies of urbanization percolate out. We get hospitals, we get ambulances, we get electricity in the countryside. And both of those trends continue. So you get narrower and narrower at the bottom, but the pyramid gets taller and taller and taller. And so your birth rate drops because you're urban now, but your life expectancy has extended. And China's probably the best example here. From the point that they started their industrialization process in the late 70s, the birth rate has steadily ticked down as life expectancy has steadily ticked up. And from roughly 1980 until roughly 2020, their population doubled, but with fewer and fewer children every year. As your population lifts up that age bracket, you get bulges. And at first, it's all good. Because when you have a lot of people in your 20s and your 30s, when that's where your bulge is, those are the people who do the consumption. Those are the people who do most of the low and mid-value added labor. And this is the story of the Chinese industrial boom that we know. But if you keep aging, that bulge moves from the 20s and the 30s into the 40s and 50s. At the same time, that group at the bottom, the children, continues to get narrower and narrower and narrower. And as that narrow section starts to lift up itself, you're now not just running out of children, you're running out of people in their 20s and their 30s. And this is where China was roughly 15 years ago. And in that environment, your advanced worker cadre, people's in their 40s and their 50s, it's super saturated. Their high value add work relative to their economic skill set for the economy as a whole does really well. And they start to outcompete everyone. And as you start edging into the early 60s, they become capital rich as well because they have a whole lifetime of expertise behind them and their kids have left home, so most of their big expenses are gone. But what is happening now is we're just going to the next step. That bottom part, the children, has been narrowing now for 60 years. That middle part with the adults has been narrowing for 40 years. And we're about to have a big bulge throughout the advanced world and just behind them in China, now moving into mass retirement. And so what was good for consumption and then was good for investment in production is now good for nothing because retirees don't add value. They liquidate their savings. They go into very low velocity investments, which really aren't used for industrial development at all. And you're left with an economy that we don't even know how to put a name to. And we're going to see the majority of the rich world move into that environment in just the next few years. And China, if you believe the new data that seems to be leaking out of their census as of just a couple of weeks ago, it looks like they are far further along than we've ever thought. And they are absolutely going to age out this decade as well, assuming nothing else goes wrong. And in that sort of environment, globalization at its core becomes impossible because globalization is ultimately built on consumption. The European Union has worked for the last 25 years, even though it has a terminal demography, because they can sell to the wider world. But when too many countries pass that threshold, that's no longer possible. And so the developing world has not developed enough and is aging even faster than what we've seen go on in the rest of the world for the last 60 years. So every piece of the value chain and of the trade system that we've become used to in globalization, most of it just doesn't work anymore. You can have some smaller regional systems where the local geography and the local demographics interact in a constructive manner, but a global system that is not.